Good morning, everyone. I'm Reverend Dory, and this is Corinth and the New Christians. And if you turned on earlier and found that there was a video already uploaded, I accidentally did not record the lecture, but ended up recording the discussion afterwards. So this is now the lecture to replace that video that I mistakenly made. Today we're going to talk about Paul's letters to Corinth. Paul wrote more letters to Corinth than any other church. It was his most successful church. It was his largest church of all the ones that he founded. And it had a lot of issues and problems. And Paul directs letters to them around those issues. And you know, it's interesting because we don't think of letter writing as ever being a new technology, but it really was. Prior to this time, you sent a messenger with your message when you were going to tell somebody something. Or if you were an important person, you might send a whole scroll that was made out of parchment. This is a piece of parchment. It's made from goat's or sheepskin, and I haven't treated it well, so it's no longer really very flexible. But scrolls were made from this, and it was very expensive material, as it is today. And so if you had a proclamation, for example, you might have a scroll that you would use and to send someplace. But as far as sending a letter, it's a new idea. And Paul learns about this new idea from when he's in Corinth. You see, the Romans were really good at adapting other people's technology. And if we go back to the time that they went to Egypt, Egypt had this plant called the papyrus plant. It grows with a bulb and the leaves are underneath the water. And then it has this long stem, sometimes 16 to 18 feet tall. And then the flower is up here in this spiky kind of flower. Well, now this stem turned out to be a very useful thing. And they would cut it and they turned it into papyrus. But papyrus is actually kind of the afterthought. They made boats from it. They made baskets. Probably Moses's basket was made from papyrus. They made sandals from it. They made all kinds of mats. And almost as an afterthought, they made paper. Now, when you can kind of see all the different layers in the paper. And the layers went, they would lay it out partly this way. They'd cut it into really thin strips, then lay it out across, and then lay it vertically. And then they would weigh it down. And the natural sap in the papyrus would glue it all together. And that's how they made a lot of things, but including paper. And when the Romans went there, they found that the Egyptians used this stuff they called papyrus to make lists on, to make bills on. And the Romans were like, you know, I think I could write a letter home on this stuff. And so they started using it for letter writing. And later for making books. There is what's called a codex. We would call it a book. And it's mentioned as early as 110 AD that someone had made a codex. A codex is nothing more than a whole bunch of papyruses put together and attached on one side. And then the nice thing, one of the things about papyrus, you can write on both sides. So they made what was called a codex. And among the most important discoveries archaeologically was a whole series of codex in what's called the Nag Hammadi Library, which was buried at 367 AD. And among them is the Gospel of Thomas. This was discovered in 1945. And the reason why this is so important is not only did it give us a lot more early Christian writings, but the Gospel of Thomas is a list of sayings that Jesus said. And they are not exactly the same as the lists of sayings that Matthew, Mark, and Luke used. So they have this, so we now have a comparative list of sayings that maybe we can get a little bit closer to what Jesus actually said. So that's a little bit later on, these codex, but for now, Paul is using the Roman letter writing new technology. And the interesting thing is he uses the Romans came up pretty quick, I guess, with a method for writing a letter. So you first had the greeting, saying who the letter's from, and then you have a prayer, praying to your God for something, a thanksgiving, thanking the recipient for whatever, the main body, then salutations or personal greetings, and a benediction. So suppose my son, Andrew, was writing to me, he might say, "Hello, Mom and Dad, this is Andrew. I'm praying that God will bless your day and that you will have a long life. I thank you for how you raised me and how much I learned from you. I'm doing fine, but please send money and tell all my neighbors and my friends that I'm doing okay. And sincerely yours, Andrew." So that is the format that Paul uses in virtually all of his letters. And one of the things that's nice about the benedictions is that we still hear them in church today. So at the end of the service. So one of the things I would tell you is that papyrus, during the time of the Romans took it to India, and they planted it in India, and the papyrus now has completely been wiped out in Egypt, and they are now going back to India to get the papyrus to replant in Egypt. So it's just one of those things that's sort of amazing, the way how things get passed around, in the same way that the grapes from France were planted in Missouri, and then when they were wiped out, they took the plants back to France, and we in Missouri helped the French wine vines survive. Also, if you think about this isn't Paul sitting down at a desk and writing. He is dictating to a secretary, and he's probably stomping back and forth, and like when you're dictating, not all of his sentences are good sentences. Sometimes they're fragments, sometimes they go on and on and on. I think the most amazing thing about Paul's letter writings is how extravagant he is with paper. Paper is still pretty expensive, but he doesn't seem to have any sense that he shouldn't write things as long and detailed and theological as he does. So, as I said, the first letter he wrote, he goes to Corinth, discovers letter writing, papyrus, and the first letter that we know of is written from Corinth to the Thessalonians. And then he leaves Corinth in 52, And between 52 and 55, he's in Ephesus or that area in Turkey. And we think he wrote 5 letters to the Corinthians and maybe made as many as 3 visits. It's about a 2 or 3 day boat trip from Ephesus to Corinth. And we also know at some point he went up and around through Galatia and then across to Philippi and down the Greek peninsula. So, as I said, there's quite a number of these letters that are referred to. For example, what's called the previous letter is referred to in 1 Corinthians chapter 5:9. This is either a totally lost letter, or it may have been that we have a piece of it in 2 Corinthians 6:14 through 7:1. It's a letter about keeping yourself safe from immoral people, staying away from people who might cause you to fall, cause you to sin. And that's what this is about. And so maybe we have a piece of that letter in 2 Corinthians. The letters were actually accumulated about 90 AD, well after Paul died. They began to collect these letters. And one thing about papyrus is it's pretty fragile. It can either get broken, the edges can get broken off and you can lose part of the letter, or if it gets damp, it disintegrates. They didn't collect the letters for about 40 years. And so we don't know whether or not in 2 Corinthians we have pieces of other letters, or if it was that way. But let me continue on with my thing. Then we have 1 Corinthians, which is sent after this. The Chloe's people have arrived with a letter for Paul, which we don't have. And one of the things is that Paul's letters are always one side of the conversation. So we have to, it's like listening to one side of a phone call. We have to sort of figure out what it is that the Corinthians are worried about and their problem, and what is he addressing. So he writes what we call 1 Corinthians, and it's sent by Timothy, and the whole theme is about divisions within the church. So this is our 1 Corinthians. Paul visits at some point, and then is what's called the severe letter. Paul is really angry, and if we have this letter, it is the second part of 2 Corinthians. Now, it may be that this letter is lost, and that 2 Corinthians is a similar letter that was written after the early part of 2 Corinthians. So some scholars think that 2 Corinthians, the first part of it was written, and then he'd set it aside, maybe waiting for someone to then be able to take it. He gets news from Corinth that's very upsetting to him, and he writes this second part of it, which is very angry. Now, what he's angry about is people from the outside have come and are disrupting his churches. They are trying to tell the people in Corinth that he's not really an apostle, that he really doesn't know what he's talking about. He never met Jesus, and they're also trying to get the Corinthians to do some other things. We don't quite know who these outsiders are. There's several candidates, but Paul is really put out at these outsiders. So 1 Corinthians is about divisions within the church. 2 Corinthians is about outsiders coming in and disturbing the church. If you believe that you have sections of letters that were then put together, then you think that the severe letter is the end of Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and it's sent by Titus. And then Paul begins to regret that he sent this letter. And so he travels up from Galatia and actually meets Titus in Philippi. We know that this happened. And apparently the thinking is that he writes this reconciliation letter, which is the first part of 2 Corinthians, and then goes on to go to Corinth himself. As I said, we don't have, on 2 Corinthians, we only have one beginning, greeting and prayer and thanksgiving, and one ending. And we don't know whether or not those pieces got lost, or if somehow this was one big letter with two very different topics, and the other kind of letters that are referred to are lost. We really don't know, but we do know that 2 Corinthians is very choppy, that there are times when you seem to have a topic, and then all of a sudden there's another topic, and then it goes back to this topic. Now, that could be partly dictation, but it could also be that somebody put in another letter when they were putting them together. So that ends the lecture part, and I hope you're able to get this. Thank you so much.